You're listening to Honestly Mental, the podcast, and I'm your host, Erika Diaz. I'm a wife, a mama, a woman in leadership, but y'all, I'm a perfectly imperfect human. I have depression, PTSD, and generalized anxiety disorder, and I am figuring it out every single day. It's really been quite the journey, so this podcast aims to provide a raw and authentic approach to several issues surrounding mental health. Through the lens of our guests and I, we will provide insight into how we navigated our own challenges through honest and vulnerable conversation. We are building a community of individuals committed to changing the world, one conversation, one person at a time. We are raising awareness by destigmatizing mental health through continuing the conversation. We are providing hope and ultimately have a goal of saving the lives of those who may be feeling dark and alone. Alrighty, let's jump into today's episode. Today, we are going to be discussing something I think that is extremely important. And really, it's the fact that your past experiences do not define who you are. They may shape who we are as individuals, but it's really important to differentiate that things happen to us and not are not us. So with that, I figured I would walk you through who I am today and how I define myself. But in all honesty, I still don't know who I am really. But I can start by saying I'm a wife. I have been with my husband for 14 and a half years, and we met under pretty unique circumstances. So I had just gotten out of an abusive relationship, and I really wasn't looking for anything. I was working at a bar, and I was working at a call center during the week. And one weekend, a regular came in with their friend who is now my husband, Sergio. And, I turned him down multiple times as he was trying to, I guess, hit on me. And I remember going outside and he was just trying to talk to me. And I was like, no. I am not interested in speaking with you. And then, he shared that he was military, and I was like, nope, been there, done that. I've, experienced a couple things with that weren't good. So definitely wasn't interested in somebody being in the military or having been in the military, as he was actually out at this point. So it was karaoke night, and he enjoys karaoke, and so he went up and sang Hey Jude, which, spoiler alert, that is Jude's, our firstborn son, name, and he is named after that story. But anyway, it was just a comical, beginning to our relationship. Eventually I caved. I said yes, we could hang out. And the first time I hung out with him outside of the bar, he had said that he was preparing some meat for a cookout with his family, and he invited me to come. And I was like, holy crap, you and I just met, and I don't know that I'm interested in meeting your entire family on, I guess, what would be a first date. And I had to work that evening, so I was like, I'm just going to do laundry. But the food sounded amazing. At this particular point in my life, I was staying with a roommate, eating all the fast food, and so a grilled meal sounded amazing. So I was going about my day, and eventually I decided, you know what, screw it. What can I lose by showing up to Sergio's house? So I let him know that I was coming. I think he was in disbelief. It really was a joke and wasn't meant for me to come over, but I did. And I met his entire family on our first date. And I'll say they probably didn't like me much. Sergio had just gotten home from an 18-month deployment in Iraq, and he had been stop loss, so he was technically out of the military while he was overseas. And, they had just gotten their firstborn son back. And then incoming me, a random person that works at a bar, shows up at their family cookout. And, I think they were less than thrilled. But the good news is we have a much stronger relationship now. And I mean, heck, it's almost 15 years later and we're still together, even after multiple shutdowns for Sergio. But here we are. And in addition to that, we have two beautiful baby boys. They will always be my babies. Jude is 11, and he is the picture perfect child. And he always has been. He was an easy baby. He does really well in school. He is active in sports. He was part of a club at his school that partners kids together with those who have autism or other neurodiverse challenges to make them feel at home. And he's just really growing up to be a phenomenal little man. And then there's Oliver, my COVID baby. He is absolutely something else, as I'm sure you can relate to. If you had a baby during COVID, I think they are their own breed. So he's 3 years old and he is nothing like our first. He definitely gives us a run for our money and keeps us on our toes constantly. But, I think about being a wife and I think about being a mother, and those things have not come easily to me at all. When I look back at the relationship my husband and I have had, just given my past and where I've come from, it, didn't lend itself well to have a strong, healthy relationship initially, specifically around trust. I think at this point I had been, proven time and time again that I couldn't trust those around me who were supposed to love and protect me. And the same applied here. He was no exception. And I was constantly waiting for him to leave. And because of that, I also would self-sabotage. And the way I would fight was just extremely unhealthy. I grew up in a setting where we would just get mean and nasty and name call and just think of the lowest blows you could come up with. And we took those shots as a family. And so that's what I knew. That's what I brought into my relationship with my husband. And he didn't react to it. It was probably the most bizarre thing for him on the other side, because here I would be flying off the handle and he's just looking at me. And eventually I recognized that that is not the way to fight. There is a much better way to go about this. And since I got no reaction, it really was quite easy to change. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but it was something that I definitely worked on, and do not do that anymore. I would say that stopped pretty quickly within the first couple of years of our marriage and relationship. And then being a mom, man, I thought that was going to be so easy. I was the kid who loved babysitting. I grew up in this fabulous at-home daycare, and we would always play house and take care of the other littler kids and do all the things that made me believe it was going to come natural. And it didn't at all. Now with Jude, I recall having him and being on maternity leave, holding him in my arms, and then the shooting at Sandy Hook happened. And I was devastated. I fully recognized that did not happen to me, but here I was holding this infant, and I was to care for him in this world, and there was just pure evil and madness out there. And it was a responsibility that was huge. And so I didn't take it lightly. And I think, because it didn't come naturally either, I wanted to make sure I was a good mom. I wanted to make sure I gave my kids and my family things that I didn't have by way of, how they were raised. And so, with time, I think that became easier. I look back and I think I had postpartum depression with Jude. I absolutely had late onset postpartum depression with Oliver. I was diagnosed with that about a year after he was born, around the time that he stopped nursing. And I just couldn't connect. And I look back at the experience with Oliver and how I sought out help. And that's really what made me realize that, I also had postpartum with Jude. I couldn't connect with him. I would hold him and we nursed, and that was the one time that I felt really connected. But outside of that, I just didn't know what to do with him. I didn't know how to love this thing that I had created with my husband, and just didn't want to break them. And so, that's been a journey and a fight to be where I am today, to try and be kind to myself, that I am a good wife and I am a good mother. And it's still something I'm working on, And then I'm also a woman in leadership. So, despite my past, I have made it, I would say, and what I mean by that is I have a successful career and track record. And, I'm very fortunate to be able to support my family as a single income household. Now, of course, when you get laid off, that adds its own kinks to a situation that was already difficult. But it's where we're at today. And, I poured my identity and my heart and soul into work. And, while I've been in the staffing industry for 13 years, I have been working since I was 14 years old. And I learned how to manipulate labor laws. So you've got to understand that at home, my circumstances were really challenging. We had issues with mental health in my family at home. We also had a blended family. My family's super complex in that I have an older sister and we share the same dad. I have an older brother and we share the same mom. I have a full brother, and so obviously we have the same biological parents. And then I have a stepsister and a stepfather. And, so there are, in essence, 3 different family arms, if you will, that made up my unit. And it wasn't easy. I would go to my dad's house every other weekend. I would spend a lot of time there. My grandma lived there, along with a household of, several other people. So I got to see family and things when I was there. But, it was a time when I didn't want to be home, and it wasn't my safe place, if you will. So when I turned 14 and I was able to work, I got my first job at an ice cream parlor, and then I worked at a grocery store. I had a stint at Chuck E. Cheese and a couple of bars. But what I was able to do is manipulate the child labor laws, and I worked 2 jobs during high school for nearly the entire time that I was in school. I'd work 16 and a half hours at one job and 16 and a half hours at the other job to kind of lay low. And, one, I felt I had to do that because I needed to get out of the house. But more, it gave me a sense of control over my destiny. And I could rely on myself to put in the effort to do a good job and be recognized at work. And that was my identity since I was 14 years old. That's why I, hit this plateau, if you will, of reaching the edge and having a complete mental health crisis, because fast forward some years and I was working in an environment that I lacked feeling seen or heard. And what that did was really just created my world to spiral out of control. And I landed myself in the outpatient partial hospitalization program. I might refer to that as the PHP throughout the podcast for you following at home. And as part of the work following that episode early last year, I recognized that as soon as work became my identity or my safe place, it was no longer work. I learned that in the program that I completed. And so now I've got to figure out who I am outside of work. And I'm still working on it. It's a work in progress for sure. And it's simple things, or things that maybe I would think would be simple. And it's, what do I like? I don't know. I enjoyed gardening one year, but then that changed the next. I am trying to get into reading books, but I'm finding I'm not the best at creating time for that. That kind of ebbs and flows. I love listening to music in my car while I'm driving super loud. And so those are a couple of the things that I'm figuring out, about myself. But at the end of the day, I still don't know who I am. And I have to put in the work to go on the journey of discovering myself after years of masking and stuffing. So when I think about my past, there are a couple of things that, I want to share. And as a trigger warning, I guess, if you will, it does involve sexual assault and sexual molestation. So if that's a topic that is difficult for you to hear, this is your cue. But I would encourage you to stay and listen. I think that just knowing the statistics out there about child sexual abuse and even abuse as an adult, that I'm not the only one that has been through the awful circumstances that I've been a part of. And so I want to talk about it because while it's not who I am, it again shaped who I'm becoming. And I think there are certain skills that I've learned, and albeit through survival mechanisms, that have enabled me to push forward. And that's, my perseverance and my resilience. Those can't be taken away. And I think that because of everything I've been through, I always wanted to do well at school. I always wanted to do well in the workplace, to make sure that as I grew older and started a family, that I would do my damnedest to not end up in the same position or create an environment for my children as was my upbringing. And so, I think about a time I was in third grade and, our family was going through it. My mother, for our own good, had given up custody to my grandma for a 6-month period of time while she was getting some things straightened out. And I think that in of itself was hard to wrestle with as an 8-year-old, and not understanding fully why my mom was basically and legally handing us over to somebody else to care for us. And she could have never guessed what was going to happen over that 6-month period. But, I was put in a scenario where I was repeatedly molested, and what that did as I got older is created this situation where I didn't care about my body. And those around me who knew something was off, or the adults who knew what was going on, they didn't protect me. And so that fed into my issues with trust, and also just being a mom and creating a protective environment, and it wasn't just my home though. It was teachers who could tell something was wrong, but they didn't do anything. And I'm so thankful for mandatory reporters now, but wish that somebody would have helped. And the help never came. I had to fight those obstacles on my own and figure out as an 8-year-old what was happening. And I was forced to grow up extremely quickly. But I also just didn't care about my body, or myself. I, really struggled after that. I was bullied in high school. Well, even in elementary, I was not the popular kid. I think most of my friends typically weren't at the school just because of the age gaps. And so even during school, I felt alone a lot of the times. And it was just one person after the other that would let me down and let me down. And then, there are statistics out there that if you've experienced any type of childhood sexual abuse, you're 2 to 13 times more likely to be re-victimized as an adult. And sadly, I became that statistic. So when I was in high school, it was my junior year, I was 16 years old. I decided to go hang out with some friends and had some stuff to drink. And then I was sexually assaulted. And that was really difficult on so many levels, for so many reasons. One being, for example, my mom, she knew where I was at. I asked permission to go where I was going to go, but apparently she didn't tell my stepdad. So when I was in the hospital, the first thing that he said to me was, not hi, it was, well, you obviously weren't at your dad's house. And at that point, I kicked both of my parents out of the room. I could not believe that was the reaction after such a serious event. It wasn't kind. It wasn't comforting. I think it was selfish. And so what translated after that, or transpired rather, was that because of the lie that my mom was aware of, it became my fault. And she almost made it my fault. And so how that happened is my mom wanted me to tell my stepdad that I lied to her, but I didn't. And it created this massive argument. And at this stage, I just kind of became out of control. I attempted to commit suicide for the first time. I remember everything about that night up until the means in which I tried to do it didn't work. There was a period that I blacked out. And it's taken me all of this time, like this year, to be able to say that I had a suicide attempt while I was in high school. And again, no protection. So I did report my assault to the police. I met with a detective. I ultimately, there were no charges brought against the person who victimized me. It was a he said, she said scenario, and it just felt like another failure again. And so I stopped going to school. And that was where, I had all A's. I was a good student, and I stopped going. And finally, a counselor actually at the school reached out and recognized that I stopped going to school, and they wanted to figure out how they could help me. And so my schedule was reduced. I did end up having to take like a summer school course, which was just wild for me as a good student. Nobody understood why I was in there, because I was able to drop most of my schedule except for my prerequisites and still be able to graduate, and then also not have F's that I was getting hold me back. And I'm so thankful for that counselor to have thought creatively in how to get me back in school. School was a better place for me to be than at home or on my own. I remember wanting to get emancipated at one point because I just felt like I was fighting the world. It was me against the world. And I didn't have any support. And it was devastating. I also had a principal at the high school that, because he had known some of my past, and Child Protective Services were involved at one point in my home life, and he looked at me one day and he said, "Erika, you need to get the hell out of Dodge." And I knew what that meant. And so shortly after this incident, I was at my grandma's funeral, and that's where I met my first husband. Well, I had seen him around school, but he was there to support my cousin, and we just got to talking and ultimately started dating, and then got married as soon as I turned 18. And we moved down to Texas after he joined the military, and he was stationed at Fort Bliss in El Paso. And so I got the hell out of Dodge, all the way across the country. But that relationship wasn't a healthy one either. It was on and off throughout high school, and he was my high school sweetheart, and I loved him to death. But neither one of us were working through some of the traumas that we had been through. We were young and naive and immature, and it didn't work out. So once he was deployed to Iraq and I had some space away from him, I knew that I had to leave. And so I did. That ultimately propelled me into this path of super unhealthy relationship after another. The first being a means to an end, in that it was a rebound relationship. I didn't want to be alone, so I met somebody, and that's how I was able to stick to getting a divorce, even though we hadn't been married for so long. I knew in my heart of hearts that that is what needed to happen. And so that rebound relationship, it was just completely unhealthy. So then fast forward to my next unhealthy relationship, where I was engaged for some time. But sadly, that was an abusive relationship. And, I didn't care though, because by this point, I couldn't even trust my own body. I put myself in risky scenarios. I made really poor decisions, and I didn't care, but somebody was giving me attention, even if it wasn't good attention. And so I went with it until that didn't work anymore. And I was able to get out of that relationship by leaning into a support system that I had met in El Paso. and really started on a path to healing. Not anywhere close to what I experienced going through the PHP, but healing nonetheless. And, little did I know what I end up meeting my husband, or to be husband, not so long after ending that abusive relationship. I share all of this because while I have been part of the statistics in some areas, I also have beat the odds in other areas by becoming a woman in leadership. I have beat the odds by being a wife and a mother who is there to love and protect unconditionally. And I'm resetting the course of the trauma that I experienced for good. And that's what Honestly Mental is about. This podcast is to make sure we are raising these issues and these items that feed into our mental health and talk about it, to continue the conversation so that we can begin to destigmatize seeking help. This is not any different than, being sick or having a broken arm. If you had a broken arm, nobody would question you in going to the doctor. And the same goes for your mind, your brain. It's so critical to get help when things are not going well. And so all that to say, I am absolutely not my past experiences, and they do not define me. I fully recognize that those traumatic events, no matter how difficult, have shaped me into the woman that I am today. And while I can't say I'm thankful for that, I know that I'm setting my kids up for a better childhood than what I experienced. I'm still working on my own identity after years and years of people pleasing and having my identity tied up in work. And it's a journey, it's a process. It's not anything that's going to happen overnight and I'm going to wake up and all of a sudden know exactly who I am. I am figuring that out through trial and error and through an amazing support system that I have with my husband and my family and my friends, my chosen family. And I think one of the highlights of where I've come from in recent weeks is that, I had probably about 4 weeks ago a situation where I was really struggling with suicidal ideation again. And I think I've come to terms with, until I get through loving myself and being kind and compassionate toward myself, I'll still have to fight those thoughts off. But a couple weekends ago, I thought I was having a heart attack. And I've had panic attacks for years. I don't have a variation in how they manifest themselves. I know what is going to happen with my body as it, is occurring. But this was different. This was pain in my chest and pain in my back and my jaw and my shoulder. And all I could think about is I didn't want to die. I wasn't ready. And so I say that because there have been times where I've faced death and I've wanted to die. And in this moment, I'm holding on to it because I did not want to die. I did not want to leave my family, and I still don't. Even on my most difficult days when I'm fighting suicidal ideation, I don't want to die then either. But I've got to use the tools in my toolbox, and hopefully for you, you'll learn and take some tangible advice from this podcast to help you out. And with that, we'll go ahead and call it a wrap. Thanks for listening. If you would be so kind as to comment below, subscribe, it would be hugely appreciated. Thank you.